After our initial meeting, it was clear to both of us that Anazal could not destroy me. But rather than enrage or frustrate him, now he was obsessively curious. We descended into the dark cave in the cliffside that he had claimed as his lair. The further we went, the less like a cave it looked. The rough and natural walls gave way to smooth carved stone, covered from floor to ceiling in sparkling runes, intricately carved into the rock, then filled with what looked like silver. The amount of time and craftsmanship it would have taken mere mortal to construct something like this was staggering. That he had apparently done so quite easily by himself hinted at his power. We descended further into what I can only describe as a throne room of sorts. Though it wasn't quite like the traditional seat of governmental power that I had seen in Athal's palace, it was lavishly decorated with fine art on the walls, plush rugs made from animal pelts covering the floor, gold and silver containers and trinkets twinkled in every corner. Toward the far end, a large, ornately carved golden throne, inlaid with various large gems, awaited its master. The place was so overdone, in fact, that it had slipped from regal into simply ostentatious, and I found it rather vulgar and unappealing. The room was clearly designed to impress by someone who had never known riches before being inundated with them. Though who he was trying to impress was beyond me. As he'd said, he does not suffer visitors to the island, much less into his lair. I suppose he thought such opulence was an impressive outward display of his power for any who might, however briefly, witness it. I don't know. I'm afraid the inner workings of his mind even now remain a mystery to me. I can only hypothesize. What piqued my interest about the room was not the gold or gems, but the rows and rows of books lining the far wall. Floor to ceiling, from left to right, the entire wall was one large bookcase filled with various colored tomes, most without titles at all, merely a sigil denoting its previous owner. These were clearly spell books he had accumulated over the years, and the sheer number of them was staggering. I could spend decades right here in this cave and not run out of new things to learn. But first, I needed to sever her ties. When he was seated, I began my pitch. As I said when I arrived, Lord... I paused, waiting for him to supply his name or correct the title I had given him. Though I already knew his name from the Blade's story, I wanted to see if he would supply it. Curiously, he did not. He let the pause continue until it just became awkward silence, and I finally continued. I'm looking for a mentor in the arcane. Spells and trinkets abound in the land of the living, he began, waving his hand dismissively toward the continent. More than enough to appease even the childish curiosity of a vampire, he said, making no effort at all to hide his obvious contempt for, not just me, but other practitioners of the art. I have studied the spells of the living, I said. A subtle gesture and a snap produced a small flame resting upon the end of my index finger. Passing one hand in front of the other and then back again produced a similar effect upon the end of each finger. These tricks, I said, indicating my flame-tipped fingers, may be suitable starting point for a beginner, and perhaps might remain useful for a hedge mage intent upon impressing easily amused peasants. But I clenched my fists and the flames disappeared. I require far more than parlor tricks to obtain what I seek. And what exactly is it you seek? He asked. Freedom. There is but one cure for your affliction, vampire. He never addressed me by name or title, even after I had told him both. Perhaps, I answered, acknowledging the possibility that what I sought simply could not be done. And though I clearly do not have the same mastery over the arts that you do, I have learned at least one lesson along my journey. I doubt that, he scoffed. What can be done by magic can be undone by magic, I said as a not-so-subtle challenge. Throughout that initial conversation, it became increasingly clear to me that the Forgotten, the name he called himself, thought of himself not as a master of the arcane, but the master of the arts. He thought his own power and understanding was unrivaled by any but the gods themselves, and even that he intended to correct. Whether he was right or not remained to be seen, but while he was clearly driven by his lust for power, his ego was a close second, and I used that to goad him into cooperation. Even the magic of a god, I added with a smirk. It is very hard to read the level of interest in an individual's expression when they simply have no expression. His skeletal face revealed nothing. He simply said, "Explain." I described to him the ritual that had brought about my curse, and he became deeply interested. In normal conversation, he could be dismissive, arrogant, and aloof, but he became instantly attentive and obsessed the moment we discussed anything magical. When I had finished, we sat silently for a few moments as he pondered. "And you say this ritual came from a god?" he asked. "Indeed, though apparently not the one I had thought it came from when I performed it." "Then which?" he asked. "Ina." Again, he was hard to read, but I thought I saw a brief but intense glimmer in the glowing orbs that replaced his eyes. I was fairly certain he was at least intrigued. With a subtle gesture of his hand, a book came floating off the shelf and casually drifted across the room toward him, followed by a quill and ink. When he had these things, he began writing down everything I had just told him, and he didn't address me again for so long, I wasn't quite sure whether I should interrupt him with questions of my own or remain silent. I chose to begin wandering aimlessly about the room, feigning a passing interest in this bauble or that trinket as I went, until I had made my way to the only thing in the room I actually had any interest in, the bookcase. As I perused the various spines, he never stopped writing, but I could feel him watching my every move. As I wandered back and forth inspecting various tomes, he would occasionally ask me to fill in some specific detail that I had skipped over before. How many drops of blood did you mix with the dirt? How many candles, and exactly how were they positioned? He wanted to know everything, as specifically as I could tell him. Every drop, every grain, every syllable, even things I hadn't considered at the time, like tone, volume, rhythm. He wanted it all as detailed as if I were performing the ritual all over again right now, and it irritated him when I simply could not remember some of these minor bits and pieces. I knew I had him when he became even more irritated when I excused myself back to Calborn. I could feel the coming dawn, and unlike him, I needed to sleep away the daylight. As he did not share them, he found the limitations of my form most inconvenient to his work. For unraveling this magic had now become his work. Whether I continued the quest for freedom or not seemed largely irrelevant to him anymore. This was magic to study, new magic he'd not seen before, a god's magic. And he was now singularly obsessed with it. The next evening when I awoke, I began as I often did these days. I went to my office, reviewed the daily reports, signed and issued necessary orders to keep Dibbleburg running and the castle supplied. Nothing particularly interesting, just regular duties that must be done. People were already a little uneasy at what appeared to be my odd preference to keep off hours. If I stopped performing my regular duties as well, they might become too suspicious and begin asking questions I'd rather not answer. When I had finished, Captain Lucas requested to meet in person to discuss some proposed changes to patrol routes and the possibility of altering the training schedule slightly to include some new ideas he had. In the middle of his presentation, a glimmer appeared on the floor in the center of the room. Fortunately, it was behind Lucas, so he didn't notice, when a tall, robed figure carrying an emerald-topped staff materialized out of the floor. Looking back, the situation is somewhat funny to me now, though it wasn't then. Lucas went on, completely unaware of our new visitor, and the Forgotten stood there in the center of the room, silently glaring down at both of us. Clearly, he had no fear that he might be seen here, but I did. Lucas was a good man, loyal, competent, trustworthy. I've come to realize those traits are not so easy to find in people. But if Lucas turned around right now and saw the Forgotten, there'd be no choice. He'd have to be retired. To my intense relief, Anazal's image shimmered for a moment and then appeared as nothing more than a tall, somewhat pale human male wearing a long red robe with gold arcane sigils embroidered around the cuffs of the sleeves. The hood drawn low over his brow cast a deep shadow over his features, making it difficult to tell what he really looked like. But what could be seen were piercing eyes, a slender hawk nose, and a bushy beard. Except for the staff with the enormous emerald, he could pass for any number of other mages that people had seen pass through town. I relaxed a little and finished listening to Captain Lucas before agreeing to most of his proposals. It all sounds good to me, Captain, except the watchtowers in the mountains. I prefer patrols, not stationary watch posts where guards may become comfortable sleeping and the enemy may simply search for passages unseen by the towers. The mobility and unpredictable schedule of patrols solves both issues. Utterly destroying all enemies makes both unnecessary. Lucas practically jumped out of his skin as he spun around and finally noticed Anazal looming there behind him. "Captain Lucas," I said with a little chuckle to diffuse the situation. I appreciate your input and your ideas. Now, if you don't mind, as you can see, I have another rather impatient guest to attend to. Fortunately, Lucas didn't ask any more questions. He merely bowed in deference to me and left the office with little more than a few side glances at the robed figure he didn't know. When he was gone, I exploded in a rage. Do you have any idea what almost happened here? You nearly exposed us both. They are as insignificant as the worms that will one day feast upon their flesh, he said dismissively. It was a difficult point for me to argue with him. Existing as an outcast removed from the living suits him. He doesn't need them to survive. I do. I am as bound to the living as I am to the watchful eyes of Ina. This is where the ritual was performed, he queried, as though our discussion about exposure had come to an end. Yes, I answered, exasperated with his nonchalance. And the book, he asked. You still have the tome? Yes, here, I said, as I plucked it from the shelves and laid it on my desk for him to examine. It's blank, he said, flipping through the pages. I came over to the desk and began looking through pages myself. Every page was filled with spells and rituals just as it had been before. No, it isn't. It is filled with words and diagrams and lists, I said as I flipped through the pages. Clever, he muttered as he began to cast a spell. When he had finished, he flipped through the pages again, yet he still saw nothing. Obviously disappointed with the results, he grunted once and then moved on. Very well, read to me the ritual you performed. Now it was my turn to groan in frustration. What is it? He asked. The ritual is not here anymore. In fact, I said, scanning the pages, it's all different. None of these are spells I've learned or cast, and the ones I have used are not here anymore. Other spells? He asked. What other spells have you cast from this book? And so began another avenue of his research. When I told him what spells I had used, of course he wanted exact details, but he also wanted to know the circumstances around them. Why had I cast them? When did I notice them in the book? The precise results, etc. Over the next several nights, he grilled me with question after question, and the more I told him, the more he wanted to know. The further back we went into my past, the further back he insisted we go. Past the Second Viso War, past the night I had performed the ritual, even past the day I had first laid eyes upon this book. I wasn't sure why at the time, but it's clear to me now. He wasn't following the spell anymore. He was trying to trace the power behind it. He was beginning to understand something I had already suspected, but didn't fully appreciate. The book wasn't guarded by some spell that he could simply wipe away no matter how powerful he was. The power within the book was an extension of the power outside of it. Without a connection to that power, one simply could not read it. It was a connection he did not have, but I did.